Thank you for joining us today, and I'm very glad to be able to bring this lesson to you. This lesson today will be taken from Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 through 48. Let me just first read these verses, beginning in verse 43 of Matthew chapter 5. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say that you love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. In these verses, we find some difficult thoughts, difficult things for us to consider. Jesus starts out by saying that we should love our enemies. Now we immediately start thinking, oh, we can't do that. How do we love our enemies? Then to make it even harder in verse 48, Jesus even said that we should be perfect, just as our Father in heaven is perfect. And of course, we all know that we cannot be perfect like God is. So knowing that we cannot really be perfect, then we often try to make these verses mean something that they not intended. And we downgrade it to such an extent that we make it very easy for us to do it. For instance, we might say, well, just do the best that you can. Well, Jesus is not warning us to do the best that we can. Jesus wants us to really love our enemies. Yes, that is difficult to do. But just because we can't be perfect does not mean that we should make these verses easy. Jesus is asking us to do something which is difficult. Certainly, he's asking us to do something which is not natural. Jesus even said that we should love our enemies, and we should love our we should love our enemies because everyone loves their friends. He even said even the tax collectors love their friends. And we know that to be true. If you would ask yourself, if I would rather ask you why you love your friends or your husband or your wife, what would you say? Well, I imagine you would probably say something like, well, he or she is very considerate. He loves me. He cares for me. He makes me laugh. I enjoy being with him, or things like that. Well, who would not love a person like that? Everybody loves those who loves them and cares for them and very kind to them, and they enjoy being with them and make them laugh and so forth. Why, everybody would love a person like that. It's almost impossible not to love a person like that, isn't it? But Jesus is not saying love those kind of people. Jesus says to love your enemies. Because after all, he says even the tax collectors love their friends. Now, the tax collectors in Jesus' day were considered to be the lowest class of people. Spiritually speaking, you could not get much worse than the publicans or the tax collectors. He even says, if you greet only your friends, then what are you doing more than others? Greeting one another has for centuries been a customary token of courtesy and decency and respect. The Jews did not do that to tax collectors. Certainly they would not do that to Gentiles, for instance. Ordinarily, Jews would not even speak to a Gentile. You remember in John chapter 4, when Jesus was at the Samaritan well, he spoke to the Samaritan woman there and even asked her to do a favor for him. And the woman was very surprised because she knew that normally Jews would not even speak to her, much less ask a favor of her. Jesus even says here, what do you do more than others? In other words, he asked a question that we need to consider. What do you do more than others? If all we do is love our friends, what are we doing more than others? Just clearly shows us that God expects us to be different from everyone else. God expects us to do more than our fellow friends, people who are not Christians. You see, Jesus even said we should love our enemies. Now, this is not an emotional love. This is not saying that we become emotionally attached to an enemy, but it does mean that we make a conscious decision to act loving towards them. What does it mean to love our enemies, and how do we love our enemies? Well, first of all, you are willing to forgive them. You do not hold grudges against them if they do something to you. We were willing to forgive them. It means you're going to be willing to actively do good to them. Even if they get to the point where they need some help from you, then we're going to be willing to help them. Now, obviously, most people would not do that. Most people, if they see an enemy in need, then they would, if anything, would pile on to hurt. They certainly would not help them. But we as Christians are obligated to help even our enemies, to do good to them. But some people might ask, well, how do we love someone who simply is not very lovable? We all know some people who are just not very lovable. They have characteristics or things about them, or they do things which we find repulsive maybe, that simply do not cause us to love them. And people often ask, how can I love a person like that? Well, you quit looking for something lovable in them as the basis for our loving them. You see, that's what the average person does, but that's not what Christian does. God loves his enemies, not because of who or what they are or what they have done, but because of who he is. In like manner, then, we love our enemies, not because of who they are, what they have done, but we love them because of who we are. We want to be like God. And since we want to be like God, we love our enemies just like God loves his enemies. But the question of what do you do more than others is a serious question. You see, most people do not do that. Most people are satisfied with being just average. Students in school most of the time will do their work. They'll make fairly decent grades. They'll make what the average student does, but that's about it. In work, most people are the same way. They'll do their job, but they're not willing to do much more other than that. But the Christian cannot be average, at least according to the world standard, because the world is not our standard. Christ is our standard, and we need to follow Christ. He is our example. In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 21, Peter said, "For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps." You see, many times people measure their Christianity in terms of what they do not do. And while there are some things in life we should not do, that's not really how we should measure our Christianity. In following Christ's example, we do more than just not doing some things, but we do things that are good. For example, when Christ's life is summarized, it is often not stated in what he did not do, but rather in what he did do. For example, in Acts chapter 10 and verse 38, we find Peter summarizing the life of Christ, and he did it by saying he went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him. Notice Peter summarized the life of Christ by saying he went about doing good. Can that be said of us? Can it be said of us that we go about doing good? What do you do more than others? How do you respond to a kindness? Well, the average person responds to kindness The average person responds to a favor. But the child of God does more than that. The child of God repays an unkind act with a kind act. That's what it means to love your enemies. If an unfriendly neighbor were sick, would you make a special effort to help them? That's what a true Christian would do. In our home, is our home any different from every other home? Is our home nothing more than a place for everyone to come together to eat, sleep, and watch TV, maybe? Or is our home a home that prays to God? Is it a home where the Bible is taught? It is not obvious in our homes that God lives here and that Jesus is our example. What about your business? A business that is conducted by Christians should be different from that of others. A business that is conducted by Christians should always do things in a very honest and upright way. People sometimes love things and use people. We as Christians must do more than that. We must love people and use the things. You see, we need to be noticeably different from others. Now, obviously, that does not mean we're obnoxious. That doesn't mean we're always putting it for everybody else that we are Christians and condemning them for how they live, but it does mean that we must live differently. And yet, in most surveys that I ever read, we find that Christians live pretty much like everybody else. They divorce just like everybody else. They lie like everybody else. They may cheat like everybody else. For example, I read a survey some time ago regarding 10,000 high school students. 73% of the students who say religion was unimportant say they have cheated on their exams. Now, we should not find that surprising because, after all, these are people who say religion means nothing to them. 3/4 of them nearly said they cheated on exams. Well, what about students who say religion is important to them? Well, of those people, we find that 69% admit they cheated. In other words, the only difference between Christians and non-Christians were about 4%. 4% less people who say religion is important admit they cheated in regards to 73% of the others. Where is the real difference? There's very little difference at all. When people want to do something, often the excuse they will use is everyone else does it, or everyone else believes that. Well, that may be true. But remember, we as Christians are called to be different. It doesn't matter what everybody else is doing. We are supposed to be different. Christ demands that we do more than others. If we expect a reward different from others, then why do we think that we can live just like everybody else and still get the great reward that we want? You see, if we want a reward above everyone else, then we must accordingly do more than others. Not because I want to earn my way to heaven, not so that I deserve my reward, but because I want to be more like God. You see, that's what God is. God is a God who does far more than we can even expect and reasonably expect him to do. God even loves his enemies and sends rain on the just and the unjust. God blesses even the unjust people. Therefore, we need to be willing to do the same because I want to be like God. That's what God expects of us as Christians. So now the question needs to be answered. What do you do more than others? Don't ask everybody else that question. Don't say that refers to everybody else, but you see, that refers to each and every one of us. What do I, as a Christian, do more than others? God expects me as a Christian to do more. Can it be said that I really do it? Hopefully, we should answer that question in a very affirmative yes. We do more than others. We do it because we want to be like God. I hope this has been very encouraging and helpful to you today. Thank you.